Alrighty, assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back to the channel. Last video, I talked about 5 things that women should be looking for in the ideal Muslim husband. This video, I am going to be speaking about 5 things Muslim men should be looking for in the ideal Muslim wife. So ladies, if you're interested in watching this because you're curious, that's one thing, but this is going to be for the men, the Muslim men, the believing men. And one thing I do want to make as a disclaimer, because very often when certain subjects kind of specify men, are specific toward men, I will see a lot of women jumping in to give their input, jumping in to give their 2 cents, and sometimes it's done very aggressively. And I knew that when I made this channel, certain topics that I wanted to talk about would end up being triggers for this kind of behavior. This is my channel, and because it is my channel, I wanted to be very intentional about the kind of community I'm building around it. And I say that to mean, as Muslim women and as Muslim men, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already given us an injunction of how to operate. And it's something that has been completely lost to the gender wars of the past several decades. And this is not to say that there aren't issues that affect women. I very often people will say, well, you know, what about women's rights? I'm a woman. I'm very well educated on women's rights and how I've benefited from them to the point that I'm even able to, sit here and speak to you guys through the internet. But I want this to be a community where we are uplifting one another, we're supporting one another, and we're respectful to one another. And that we do not allow our nafs to be the thing that is dictating what we see as right and wrong, but rather we are using the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the example and character and sunnah, authentic sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to determine what we believe is right and wrong and ideal. So when I say ideal, no one's going to disagree with the ideals that I put forward for women to seek out in men, but very often, again, because of liberalism, because of ideas around toxic masculinity and influences from Western feminism, a lot of women will have opinions on what I say is the ideal wife. You're free to have those opinions. You just need to express them in a very respectful way and understand that at the end of the day, the only thing that matters here is does it stand up against, or hold up against the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. That's it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows our nature. He knows who we are. As much as we go back and forth about things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in very particular ways. Men and women are different. There's a verse in the Quran that reminds us that the believing men and believing women are allies to one another. I want this to be a space where we are embodying that verse, where we are allies to one another, where we're supporting one another. And I think that a lot of women, including myself, I did not always think like this. We have a lot of unlearning to do about the way that we deal with men. And we have to understand that when it comes to the way that we think about men, in the same way that we understand as women, right? If we are truly invested in the Quran and we are truly invested in the Sunnah, we are these autonomous human beings who have an incredible capacity to figure out what is good for us. And when we stray away from that, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants for us, we end up doing harm. In the same way, there are good believing men who are trying their best to embody the character of the Prophet ﷺ, who are trying their best to understand the Quran, who are creating space for that. And for a very long time, we neglected issues that affect men. We just assumed that they didn't happen. We were so hyper-focused on women's rights, and quite literally many times to the detriment of women, right? And this is my critique of Western feminism. Please don't twist my words. There's always bound to be someone who says something along the lines of, well, you benefited. I clearly benefited, and I'm very grateful for the things I benefited from, but that doesn't mean that I can't critique the things that are harmful, right? So with that being said, this is for guys. So ladies, please be positive, loving, super mindful of how you're interacting with this video. And if you're not able to do that, this would be a wonderful time for you to click off. All right, guys, this is for you. Assalamu alaikum. What are 5 things you should be looking for in the ideal wife? I have 4 written down. I think I have 4 written down, but I might think of the 5th one. First one, very similar to the last video. is looking for a woman who is family oriented. I'm going to give the same exact reasoning that I gave in my previous video. First, a lot of people, family oriented means a woman who wants children, right? And again, when it comes to an Islamic ideal, yes, that would be ideal to find a woman who wants children. This is not neglecting the fact that there are women who might not want children, and if you're a man who doesn't want children, good for you. You found, you find your match. You can find someone who matches you in kind of expectations, what they want in a future marriage. But in an ideal Muslim marriage, there would be children so long as Allah blesses you with them. This is something we know because the Prophet ﷺ emphasizes the importance of building that family unit. And also we know that the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to have children, with one of the biggest reasons being is that it propagates deen. It allows there to be more Muslims. And the Prophet said that he's excited to be able to boast about the numbers of Muslims on Yawm al-Qiyamah, because we're having, we're prioritizing familyhood and we're having families. There's a whole debate about what it means to be a mother. Can you be a working mom? Do you have to be a stay-at-home mom? Blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go too much into that. Obviously, everyone is free to have their opinion so long as there's no harm to the children. There's a lot more data being done on the importance of the presence of the mom figure in children's lives, in children's lives in the early years. This is something that, interestingly enough, some of the most liberal countries in the world give a substantial amount of time for maternity leave for that reason, right? They realize this is an investment in the neurological, biological, and social development of the children of their country, so they give that time off. Unfortunately, in the United States, we do not have that luxury, and many times it's not necessarily a choice. It can be very expensive to live on one income in the United States in many places. But that being said, finding someone who's family oriented is really important, because typically the person who is family oriented, a woman who is family oriented, I'm speaking from this as a woman, will also have a lot of characteristics that would make her a very good wife. And, for example, it's someone who is nurturing, someone who's always looking to improve, someone who's always, seeking the comfort of the people around them. Not necessarily to the detriment of herself, right? But cares about that. And you think about the women that Khadija, may Allah be pleased with her, who was first and foremost, right? She above anything else, yes, she was a CEO and she owned her business, but very often we neglect the fact that she was a wife and she was extremely family oriented. People don't know that she didn't leave, she wasn't leaving on the trips that she was sending her caravans on. She was present with her children. She was there, as was the Prophet ﷺ, but she was extremely family oriented. And there was a huge chunk of time where we actually don't really know about what's going on in the Prophet's life, because him and his wife are spending so much time investing in their children. So finding someone who has those traits is going to be really beautiful, because it allows you to know that your children are in good hands. Because quite frankly, right, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala divided the labor in a marriage, he mandated that the man be the one who is working. So if you are working, mandated that the man is the one who has to work. And if you're working, you probably are not going to be home for those working hours unless you're working from home. But even still, you're not going to be able to be as fully present. So to know that your children, when you are taking care of your responsibility in faith, are going to be in good hands of someone who really, sees that as her role, that is going to be an incredible setup for a family. So number 2, what is the characteristic you should look for ideally in a wife? And I'm going to, this is the same thing that we said in the other video as well, because so many of these things are actually transferable, right? And that is someone who is religious. And when I say religious, if you haven't watched the previous video, I mean someone who's practicing faith, someone who is, again, ideal. Ideal is they are knocking out all of their salah, they're praying all 5 of their salah on time. They are avoiding major sin. They are trying their best to avoid small sin. They are making tawbah. They are fasting their Ramadan. They are upholding as best the tenets of our faith as they possibly can, right? And this is really also important, because very often it is the woman or the mother who's taking on the education of her children. Very often. Again, it tends to be a time thing. And personally, from really incredible Muslims that I've seen, they had influence from both of their parents in that regard, but largely it was usually their mother. And so having a good sense that you're marrying someone who, even if you have a really strong grasp on your deen, also has a strong grasp on her deen, is going to give you that comfort that, okay, my family is going to do great. Also, this makes it incredible because then you have a partner to worship alongside. That's something so beautiful. Like when you think about the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, when he became a prophet, he was leading his wife in salah, and he was leading his children in salah, and eventually he's leading Ali, who was living in his home at that time in salah. Right? That family unit, it's so beautiful, and you get to appreciate that even more when you have someone who also is practicing. Number 4, character. There is a hadith about deen and character, right? Those two things do come together, because you can have someone who's religious and practicing, but she maybe is rude or impatient or sharp with her tongue, or is dishonest or not trustworthy or whatever it might be. There are lots of characteristics that are of poor character. And those things can be really detrimental to a relationship, and obviously detrimental to a family unit entirely. Like if you meet someone who and this is shown by Dad as well, but people who have abusive mothers tend to fare far less well than people who had abusive fathers. Neither of them are okay, but there's something about your mother lacking that nurturing, caring capacity, and being hurtful and manipulative and abusive, that hurts so much more, because we tend to see our mothers, or our mothers are our first caretakers. If that was your first home, that was your first source of drink, that was your first, the place you probably fell asleep first. It just is so much more harmful to the development of a child. So be mindful. And also, just in terms of health of relationships, someone who has good character is going to be someone who is able to handle the disagreements that inevitably come, the ups and downs, the decisions, the big decisions that have to be made. They're going to be able to handle that with a lot more, how do I say, just in a much healthier way. Right? With a lot more class, with a lot more understanding, with a lot more patience. And obviously that's important for you, but we already talked about that in the last video. Number 4. God, this is going to be the one that can be super triggering to women. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And there are obviously boundaries around this, but looking for a woman who is submissive. The word is super loaded, so let's talk about it. There's different, when I see submission, first and foremost, I see submission on a spectrum, right? There's the ultra, and then obviously on the other side, it's complete. There's no submission at all. Sometimes when we think of submissive, we it's very interesting. I'm gonna save these thoughts for another thing. This is just me talking. I'm gonna save it for a video for a woman. But when I say submissive, I don't necessarily mean a woman who's just going to, honor your every beck and call, or someone who has no sense of identity and says yes to everything and isn't really. But I mean someone who submits herself to the role of a wife, and if she's a mother, as a mother, in the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows, and upholds the greatest good of the family. As husband and wife, our duty is to uphold the greatest good of what is for the family. So for a woman, that looks like understanding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mandated that the head of the household be the man. And so it is so imperative, if you want a marriage that is much more peaceful, and and there's a good sense of discourse and negotiation, but not argumenting and yelling and screaming and disregard and disrespect, is finding someone who understands and has already, who understands that reality, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this hierarchy in a family, but who has already come to accept that and sees honor in her position as a wife. Doesn't see dishonor, doesn't see lack of autonomy, doesn't see belittlement, but is honored by it. And I guess my advice to men would also be in this regard is be patient with a lot of women, because you have to understand many women did come from situations where the idea of submission was very warped in and led to them witnessing a lot of abuse of the women in their circles. And because of that, this spiritual manipulation of something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made so beautiful has caused a lot of women to just hands up and say, well, I don't want it at all, not realizing that there is a way, a prophetic, a spiritual, a way rooted in our deen to operate, right, and uphold that. And it's very much a learning experience, a learning process for a lot of women. So seeking someone who understands that and accepts that, and also doesn't just pay, lip service to it, but has really done the reflection on what that looks like for her in her life. I will also say, I think a lot of women tend to come to that idea later on as well. What is the fifth thing? I gotta make up something. Number 5. Let me think about the Prophet ﷺ's wives for a second. I got one. Loyalty. Someone who has a sense of loyalty. And this can sometimes be hard to identify in someone prior, but when I just think about one of the most incredible characteristics of Khadija, right, the Prophet's first wife, she was all in for her husband and his mission. And her loyalty exceeded any level of loyalty that I think any of us will ever get to know, because as a result of her support, she lost all her wealth and starved to death. One thing that a lot of people don't know about Khadija alayha salam, and God, that what an incredible example of a woman for women, Muslim women, is when the boycott of the Muslims happened. The boycott was of specific families and clans, and her family, her clan, was not a part of the boycott, meaning she did not have to be boycotted. She could have still accessed food and money and done her thing, but she actually entered into the boycott. She allowed herself to be boycotted, even though it ended up being the death sentence for her. She starved as a result of this and died because of it. Why? Because this was her honoring, obviously above all, honoring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also honoring her husband. Listen, it's very rare to find a woman who's already in that mindset. Why? Because sometimes it takes time to build that trust, to build that loyalty, and a woman has to be all in and see a certain level of competency. I think a lot of men just assume that they're going to get this level of loyalty without demonstrating that competency, because women, I think for a lot of us, we seek out a certain level of safety and a certain level of almost like a guarantee that if I trust you, things are going to be all right. And so when we keep seeing examples of this falling through, because there are men who are maybe not upholding their responsibility, or they're trying to live their single life as a married man, and unfortunately I've seen this a lot in marriages, and on a lot of those marriages it has failed and the couples ended up divorced. It is very hard to have that loyalty, because you're almost like, I'm standing on a sinking ship. You want me to be loyal to a sinking ship? So just be mindful of that. Sometimes it's not you. Sometimes it needs time, and it needs those shows of competency, and it needs, like discourse. It needs, if you're making decisions that are going to affect another person's life so much, you can't just say, hey, I'm making this decision, live with it, but this is why I'm doing it, and I need you to support me in this, and here's my plan if maybe it doesn't work out, whatever it might be. You'd be surprised at just how that level of communication can really make a huge difference. That's all I got for you guys. I hope that this was helpful. Feel free to leave comments if you have questions or other topics you'd like me to talk about. And yes, assalamu alaikum everyone.